This is putting the bits back together, doing forensic investigations in Amazon Web Services, EC2. If you are here hoping for something else, I'm really sorry to disappoint you. There's also going to be no in-flight service today, so further disappointment. A little bit about me. My name is Brandon Sherman. I'm a senior cloud security engineer at Twilio. We are a noted clothing manufacturer and also we dabble in technology. We're a cloud communications company. We make it possible for text messages, voice, video, fax, all these different means of communicating to be accessible to you through APIs. I'm also a Krav Maga instructor in sort of my hobby. My mentor once described security as being like being in a boxing ring and fighting rounds until you get knocked out. And I was perfect because that's pretty much my hobby. I generally have a cloudy outlook on life and technology and all that, which is only somewhat affected by the fact I've spent about 4.5, 5 years now working with Amazon and AWS. I'm a certified cloud solutions architect, professional grade, which means that I get 20% more LinkedIn spam, and I have definitely drunk the cloud Kool-Aid. So, what we're going to talk about. We're going to start out with why. We're going to go and talk about the sort of some background on AWS, EC2, and EBS. Quick show of hands, who here uses Amazon Web Services? Cool. Anyone just sort of cloud services in general? Anyone just wanted to raise your hand because you wanted to? Awesome. We're going to go through the sort of research methodology and my findings, and then we're going to talk about protecting your forensic data, keeping control of that chain of custody. So one of our values at Twilio is to start with why. And personally, this is one of my favorite values because it always makes you think, what's sort of the driving purpose behind this? And one of the big reasons why is, well, shit happens. Proof of this exists all over. It's good to know we're going to need some of these techniques eventually. So, other reasons why. Compromises happen. We're at a security conference. We're talking about how to protect data from things going wrong. This is actually a great side because I've given this, and one of my coworkers like every time you leave that to-do in there, and I told him it's great because it's always relevant. Last time it was Newegg. Last week it was Facebook. Who knows what it'll be next week? The other reason why is that prevention is ideal, but detection is a must. This is a very difficult sort of field to be in. There's a very good chance at one point we're not going to get something right. And that's why it's important to know not just that we've stopped an attack, but when an attack does happen, we know the full breadth of that attack. How can we know how bad something was if we can't detect it? So a forensic investigation is investigating an event that happened in the past, and we're going to use scientific techniques to do so. We're going to start out, we're going to say what we're going to do, we're going to work our way through it, we're going to show our work, and that way we can come to a conclusion at the end. This is not the sort of thing that we want to be doing after an event. We want this capability to know how to do something reliably and repeatably before something bad happens. And personally, I just find what's hidden a lot more interesting than what's visible. So, has an attacker deleted log files? Have they caused log files to roll over? Did they use some malware dropper that erased itself? What's going on sort of behind the scenes that someone's trying to hide from me versus what someone's willing to let me see? So we're going to start out and talk about the cloud. And for the purposes of this talk, we're just going to say that Amazon Web Services is the cloud. Google Cloud, Azure, other clouds out there, they exist. I don't work with them as frequently as I do at AWS. Some of these techniques may be transferable. So one of you can give this talk next year on a different cloud service. This is also not supposed to be an introductory course to AWS. I saw a lot of hands go up. This is also not meant to be an advanced course in AWS. I want to give you just what you need to know to understand the rest of the techniques. Amazon Web Services is comprised of a lot of these services. That's what the console looks like, at least recently. I didn't check it today. We're going to be focusing on 4 of those. If you missed out where EC2, Elastic Cloud Compute, EBS, Elastic Block Storage, IAM, which is Identity and Access Management, and S3, the Simple Storage Service, they're in those spots on the console. So EC2 this stands for Elastic Cloud Compute. It's a unit of computation. It's essentially a virtual machine on demand. You can even now rent by the minute bare metal instances from Amazon, which is another interesting concept. But they all have different capabilities in terms of CPU, RAM, networking, GPUs, etc. It's very, very simple. You click a button and you get a server. If you have an API, you hit that API endpoint, you get another server. If you have a script with a loop, you hit the API a lot, and you get a lot of servers. By default, all of these servers are going to be scattered through the data center. They have shared tenancy, but if your security needs require it, then you can use dedicated tenancy, and that way you know that your neighbors on the hypervisor are at least other instances owned by you. The starting point, the sort of golden boot image for an EC2 image is an AMI. It's an Amazon machine image. This is the initial host operating system, any configuration, any software. That's sort of the initial bootstrapping. It's possible to create one of these machine images from a running instance. And this is going to include any configuration files and software on that instance. Makes it very easy if you need to duplicate a server to just create an image from it and launch a new server. But this is going to come back a little bit later in the talk. Some instances have what's called instance storage. Some of them don't. This is, I'm sure, shocking. The instance storage, though, is interesting from a forensic standpoint and from a security standpoint because it's ephemeral. It's directly connected, it's very fast, but it's also designed to basically go away once your instance stops running. This is in contrast to an EBS volume, Elastic Block Storage. This is where you request a volume, you say, I want a 15 gigabyte volume and I want it attached to this host. Kind of sort of think of it like network attached storage, but it shows up locally. And there's different backing mechanisms behind EBS. So these days, if you want block storage, you get 5 different options. And they all have a backing between spinning disks, solid state disks, different throughputs, different maximum sizes, different prices, naturally, charged in cents per gigabyte per month, which is fun for your accounting teams. But this is sort of when you want a persistent disk that won't go away once your instance does, you use a EBS volume. But the cool thing is that they all have the same annualized failure rate, between 0.1 and 0.2%. Doesn't matter how big, doesn't matter what backing material is, none of that matters. It just fails about an order of a magnitude less than a commodity off-the-shelf hard drive. So, how does Amazon guarantee this failure rate across multiple drives? Or rather, how do they guarantee this failure rate in a single drive that is made up of something mysterious on the back end? It's about 20 times more durable than a hard drive you could go out and buy and stick in your laptop or a server in your rack. So, is this magic? Well, it's probably something a little bit more sinister than that. So, to recap, Elastic Block Storage is disk storage that's actually network attached storage that has different capabilities that, depending on which type of instance you are attaching it to, will show up either on the SATA bus or the NVMe PCI bus. It can be dynamically sized upwards, but it's statically allocated. They fail 1/20th as often as a regular off-the-shelf drive, and you can take a snapshot of them with an API call. The contents of that snapshot is kind of what we really get into in this talk, because with all of this magic going on, or this dark black magic that's happening in the background, is this snapshot something that we can use to make a forensic investigation possible? We're also going to talk about a little bit of knowledge for identity and access management. This is pretty fine-grained permission controls, who can do what, when, where, why. But for example, taking snapshots is a permission that can be granted or also restricted. Deleting snapshots, likewise, is a permission that can be granted or restricted. And this really comes into the chain of custody that's going to be necessary to follow to ensure that these snapshots are kept safe. S3, so right, you can take a snapshot of that volume. It gets stored in S3. The snapshots don't have to be done when that EBS volume is offline and detached. You can take a snapshot from a running instance. Amazon warns you that you might see data inconsistencies. I've personally never seen one really go wrong, but it is possible. You're taking a snapshot of a running, moving disk with data flying on it. These snapshots are stored in S3, and they're immutable. The AMIs are special EBS snapshots. So an AMI is just an EBS snapshot that's been blessed, so that way you can use it as a boot volume. And you can launch your volume from these AMIs, but you can launch them on either to start with EBS or ephemeral storage. It kind of matters just sort of for performance and what you want to get out of your virtual hardware. But the snapshots, they're also versioned. They're not sort of version 1, version 2, version 3, but each time you take a snapshot of a disk, you get a new snapshot ID. You're only charged, and the only parts of the snapshot that are taken and kept are the parts that are different from the earlier snapshot. So your V1 snapshot ID is going to be the full disk, then V2, V3, V4, V5, as long as you keep taking snapshots, will get different IDs, but may only be a few bytes different. If you need to delete a middle snapshot, you might be waiting a while because you've got to compute the diffs on both sides. But this also means that you can take a snapshot of a volume multiple times. Maybe you don't want to terminate an instance right away. You suspect that it's compromised. You want to do an investigation, but you don't want to take it offline so you don't tip your hand. In this way, you can keep seeing what's on the disk without necessarily taking it offline, taking a snapshot, and then doing an inspection of it. All right, story time. So if we have 4 different people, and they are all going to play a game of Clue. Clue is a trademark of Milton Bradley, EBS is a trademark of Amazon, and we're going to pretend that the Clue board is a hard drive, rather a EBS volume. And each square here is a block that data has been written to, a player has been moved through. So Clue, if you don't know, it's a classic whodunit. You're trying to figure out, by moving around the board and picking up clues, who did what. So did Miss White erase the log files in the library? Was it Colonel Mustard in the kitchen who was forcing log files to roll over and hide his tracks? Well, let's take a snapshot and investigate. If only we could see past turns that had been deleted that were on the board. So if we take a snapshot of an EBS volume, one of these API calls, is that snapshot going to contain in-use blocks, or does it also contain the deleted blocks? If I make it's an ext4 file system, I delete a file. It's very easy to understand that from a sort of hypervisor level. Maybe those files just aren't included in a snapshot. Doesn't matter what that original volume type is. Amazon originally had just the standard EBS storage, but now there's 4 new ones. Doesn't matter what that is. And doesn't matter what the instance type is. Because these disks can show up on either the NVMe or SATA bus, depending on which generation instance they're attached to, is that going to affect our ability to either recover data or, is that going to affect our ability to delete data from these drives and make it impossible to find, or affect our ability to do the recovery? So here's the steps that I followed. Start out by launching a bunch of EC2 instances, take an EBS volume of each type, attach it to each type of instance, write some known seed files that I pulled off of my hard drive, write them to the EBS volumes, then delete those files, use the API to trigger a snapshot. Once I have those snapshots, rehydrate them onto a brand new clean EBS volume, and then go looking for files. And because this is all through APIs, I was able to write some very quick and dirty scripts that basically said, you want to start burning some cache? So this is what it looks like to burn virtual money in a virtual console, a whole bunch of instances coming online. I used the AWS System Service Manager, which is just a way basically for me to run some commands across all the machines without having to write an SSH script or use any other kind of tooling. Basically just grab these files, write them to disk, flush out the file buffers, wait, make sure they're really truly flushed, delete those files, and then again sync the file buffers. And so that goes, it runs, and then I targeted 20 instances, and I got, tells me it all ran successfully. And then since I'm not made of money, go ahead and terminate and shut all these instances down. So if we're going to go back to our Clue board game analogy, in the sort of the Magic Clue console, we triggered a snapshot of the board in its final state. And we've done this against, for whatever the EC2 instance, right, the Magic controller of that Clue board, we took a snapshot of that. And we're going to go ahead and see what happened to that board game, or what happened in that volume. To do the digging, I used software called PhotoRec. PhotoRec is freely available. It's really, really awesome software. It's used it looks at the raw blocks of a disk and compares that data to known file signatures. Has anyone ever used PhotoRec before? Yeah, vacation photos or something, like on a card wiped by accident maybe? Yeah, I've never done that. Never. So what it does is it doesn't understand file systems. It just knows when I look at a block on disk, does this match a known signature of a file type? Does this look like an image? Does this look like a PDF? What can I do and then go from there? So my forensics script was to take each of these snapshots that I had in the console, rehydrate those to a brand new EBS volume, attach that EBS volume to a forensics investigation instance, and then run PhotoRec and start looking for deleted files. And so this is just an example of the script running. So it goes and it makes a new file system on a new volume. You don't have to know what any of this means. It just looks really impressive to have text scrolling around. But the upshot of all that text scrolling around is we can get some results. And these results are a little weird. You get heaps of files showing up in the directory we told PhotoRec to write files to. And when you take a quick glance, you see various kinds of files that we'd expect. My seed files, M4A, JPEG, PDFs, a bunch of text files. But we don't just find the seed files. We find a lot more than those on the disk. And it's very, very noisy. And the reason of this is AMIs are snapshots. If you use an EBS volume as the root volume to launch your instance, it's going to be hydrated, it's going to be coming out from that AMI, and that AMI has, as a snapshot, all kinds of deleted files in it. This is potentially overwhelming. There are a lot of files that an operating system writes and uses in its sort of day-to-day operations that are sort of normal and expected. I can't tell you how many different languages of man pages show up in the results when you go looking at an AMI. So this is sort of like if the Clue OS game analogy we're using here. If the operating system that was like the rules of the game was sort of running on the same board as the players were moving around in, which the analogy breaks down a little bit, but the point being there's a lot of stuff that we're going to get back. And this clue board, it would be like if we got the instructions showing up in our results in 50 different languages, along with what we actually wanted to find, the whodunit part of the mystery. And that's just because it's very simple. AMIs are snapshots. AMIs contain deleted files. If you use photorec on a volume, that was the startup volume, so it was born from the AMI, you're going to find a whole lot of those deleted files. You will also very likely get the actuals, you'll get like your results, and we'll get into that in a second, but all the game setup. So it's like in Clue, if we started Colonel Mustard in one corner and Miss White in another corner, we would see that setup action as happening. So when you go looking at photorec results, this is what you get. A few file names, but mostly just a whole lot of, I found this type of file and I gave it a file name based off of where I found it. It is a lot of data. So how do I know, given all of these different files that I've recovered, which ones are my actual seed files and which ones are this sort of noise from an AMI? So we play match the hash. Start out by just comparing the files. And even if you're not using an image, if you're not using a snapshot of a volume that was an AMI or using a secondary volume, you're still going to get more files returned. So this is because photorec guesses where new files end and or where files end and new files start. It's not always super clear to software that's just looking at a stream of bytes and gibberish. What is a new file? What's an old file? This is especially true with text files. And operating systems, especially stuff like Linux, is made up of a lot of text files. As an example, these are some of the text files that I used. I just kind of looked at a bunch of them, and just some like the README from version 1.04 of Windows, some forensic capture textbook that was free and turned out to not be very useful. But more interesting, and this is a better demonstration of my point, this is originally the same text file. It's just a list of flights in one day in the United States, the sort of from airport and the to airport. Text files don't have really start or ends. They're just bits written to disk. Photorec doesn't know that this was originally one big text file that was seeded. It just sees, okay, here's a text file, and it goes, and at some point it stops, so I think maybe I should stop too, and then, I picked up a trail of more text files and go on from there. So this is originally one file that's now been split across into many, many dozens of files. So if you just are naively hashing the files that you find in your recovery directory and your seed files, you're going to find that most of the time you swing and you miss. You get a whole lot of files back. Obviously, these two files are never going to have the same hash as the original file. So it might be a little bit dispiriting. You think that, well, I can't like do any analysis on this if I don't know that I'm getting the data back. But if instead we compare the first few hundred bytes or so, then we can get a better sense of how many of these original files are actually recovered. And I use like 300 bytes that seem to be a kind of a good mix between false positives and true positives. And so really all it meant was I computed the hash of all of these things and then started to check and see. And again, this is just the instances and the volume types that were originally attached to them, and then looking through and doing some of the legwork to see how many files were recovered. So, up to this point, right, we've written files to disk. We've noticed that AMIs are snapshots themselves, and so they contain deleted files. We've been able to recover these files. We get a bunch of that noise from the AMI snapshots. We also get a bunch of our actual original source files back. but the original source volume type has an impact on what kind of volume, or what kind of results we can recover. The standard GP2 and IO1 volume types were sort of the best recovery. The SC1 and ST1 were not so good. And this is just, sorry if it's a little bit small, but for the SC1 and ST1, it was 47% and 20% respectively. And these numbers, if you go out and you do this at home, they will vary because of that magic Amazon's doing in the back end of somehow being consistent when I ask for a block back, but distributing that block amongst multiple other systems of redundancy, and who really knows? I don't know. I don't know how EBS works. If someone here works for Amazon and wants to pull me aside and tell me, then awesome. Love to know more about the sort of man behind the curtain. But anyway, so these two types of EBS volumes designed for large data, consistent throughput. It's not saying that they were bad in any means, it's just that compared to the other volumes where it's 89% recovery plus, was very, very good when it comes to recovering data. These other volume types just kind of stand out in comparison. But the weird artifacts don't stop there. When I was recovering from the SC1 and ST1 drive types, there were times that I got truly massive files back. No other volume type did I have that issue with. It was just with these two large bulk storage ones. And this is just a capture of that. So originally written seed files to disks, did the recovery, and then I looked at just to see how much disk space I had gotten. I was using to know if I could use the same disk for other recoveries, and I found that there's 272 gigs used on my forensic recovery drive. And part of that is because when you go looking at the different files that were recovered, if you don't speak exact bits, there's some of these PDFs were taking 161 gigs. The PDF or the video files, the M4P files, 180 megabytes, exactly what we expected, perfect match. But these other PDFs, 21 gigs, 24 gigs, and this was, the 24s are sort of almost outliers. I consistently was getting these massive files, and I actually had to increase my target volume size because I was simply just getting so many of these massive artifacts back. PDFs are generally not that big. If you know of like an actual legit PDF that big in the wild, let me know, because it sounds like you've got some really great war stories. But this was truly interesting. And so as to why, well, I got some bad news for you. I don't know. This is something that has to do with how EBS works, I'm sure, in the back end. I don't know why it's only those two types. I can sort of guess. The recovery issue where the end of file marker for that PDF was sort of found across, it was multiple disks in the back end that was sort of being concatenated together, maybe. And that maybe explains why it was only these two volumes, but it doesn't explain why only those two volumes and not other EBS volumes of different types. So again, this is who knows? If you're curious, this was the PDF. It was like 160K or kilobytes. Really just this small. I don't remember even where I got it. It was some sort of diagram pattern thing. Almost looks like Conway's Game of Life if you squint a little bit. But this file should never be that large, and it was consistent too. So now that we know we can get data back, and I'll kind of loop back around to some findings at the end here, but let's talk about protecting this data, right? That PDF, right, we really want to make sure that we can go through and know that it's safe. So snapshots can be shared to other AWS accounts. This is a really great property of them because if there's an attacker in your account and they've already breached one of your EC2 instances, they may be able to delete those snapshots. If you have over-provisioned permissions on that EC2 instance and You do a snapshot of it, you do the recovery, and you're kind of waiting, and the attacker is still in your account. They've exfiltrated an API key. They can watch you take that forensic snapshot. And then once your snapshot is completed, they can delete your snapshot. The best way to keep the snapshot safe is to move them into a separate account. So once you hold the ball, don't drop it. I hear, so I'm a millennial, so I hear I'm supposed to really like avocado toast and JSON. If you don't like JSON, I've got some sort of bad news for you. Identity and access management in AWS is almost entirely solely JSON everywhere. Permissions matter. Dealing with them in a JSON format is something that is a skill that I have acquired, and I'm really sorry for everyone else that has the ability to just parse these documents by eye, because there's a lot of room for complexity in these. That being said, so this is not a basics of securing your AWS account talk. Happy to do that at another time, but this is just what sort of things you need to be aware of when you take one of these snapshots and you need to keep it safe. So if we know that we have this forensic evidence, we want to keep it safe, we want to know it hasn't been tampered with, we can't leave them somewhere that they can be tampered with. And some of you in the back that are nodding off might be going, well, yeah, duh. But where can they be tampered with? Right? It's no longer the case that you send an investigator out and they go and they pick up a server and they image the hard drive of it and they put it in a briefcase and lock that briefcase to their wrist and they fly in a private jet back to your orbiting headquarters and do the analysis there. At least allegedly. I've been working in the cloud for so long, I forget what it's like to have physical hardware. If there aren't space stations you do your forensic recovery on, then maybe I need to get in touch with you. So we want to use, come on, there we go. So we're going to use IAM to make sure that we secure the access to these snapshots. And it's really who, what, where, when, and how. So you could potentially grant Colonel Mustard the ability to use AWS Lambda only in the lobby. You could say these API calls require MFA. They can only be done from a certain IP range. You're only allowed to operate on select resources. This is an example AWS policy. This is the administrator policy. It says you can perform any action on any resource. It's very helpful. If you are struggling with your permissions and you're not sure what you're doing wrong, why you're getting permission denied for something, this will solve your problems. Every time. There's some people here who are like, I'm not wrong though. It will solve your problem. It's going to create a whole lot of new ones though. This is the policy I attached to my EC2 instances to allow them to actually grab the seed files. This bucket's not public, so there's also no PII in it, unlike some other, like every other day there's a new one of those. But again, like this is a much more restricted policy. So if you see the ***, you want to look into that before it becomes an issue. Especially because this policy will only let me get things out of a bucket. This policy will let me modify the files in that bucket, then delete snapshots when they're taken, and then own the whole account and lock the the legitimate owners of that account out, which is another fun talk that can be gone through. But critically, even if you have that ** policy, because it's just easier than solving your permissions issues and the complexity of JSON, those permissions only work within a singular AWS account. An account is basically like erecting blast walls around something. If something goes boom in an account, it can't touch other accounts. There are configuration mistakes that you can make, but you've got to try really hard to make those happen. And even still, those API keys aren't going to magically have the power into other accounts. So when you get notice that there's an instance behaving strangely, and you're doing an investigation into it, do you know what's on that instance? Does that instance have a policy that is star star? Does it have a policy that lets you permission escalate to star star? Are there not even necessarily permissions granted to it, but someone couldn't figure out how to do that, or they wanted to work in another account, and so they put their API keys on that instance, static credentials? Are those on that instance? And yes, you can do a forensic recovery and find API keys people have hard-coded into that instance. So what happens in that? Well, strictly speaking, the planet is like a blast radius, right? This is, I think many people would consider to be bad situation. So if we think of sort of this detonation as happening, what's going to contain it? Well, the fact that at some point there is no more planet left to go boom. However, other planets are going to be perfectly unharmed and not suffer any ill consequences, although they might laugh a little bit at the loss of the whole planet. The analogy that I'm trying to make here, which is sort of getting away from me in the whole Spectacle and Michael Bay show, is another Amazon account can be very easily set up and by default cannot be touched by anyone else in that other account. So don't take chances. You take that snapshot, and as soon as it's completed, initiate a copy to another account. Get it out of the danger zone. There's I felt like I couldn't go through this talk without touching on AWS CloudTrail. It's a cataloging of API calls. Almost all of them, there are some caveats to that. I feel like I've been saying that a lot. This you can do this, but then there's a caveat to it, which is but it is almost all the important things. It is all of the important things rather in an account. Enable it. Write those log files to a separate account. This does you two favors. One, it can help you figure out if someone is on that EC2 instance and is trying to like list snapshots continuously, trying to see if they can delete any of them. But also, this gives you proof. This gives you a proof of your custody over a snapshot and let you say, oh yeah, I know that this user, Forensic Investigator A, logged into this account and they performed these actions: trigger snapshot, name snapshot, copy snapshot to other account. And then once in that other account, Forensic Investigator B logged in and they attached that snapshot to a new host and they performed an analysis of it there. So this helps dramatically with your chain of custody. You don't need to have a log that's viewed and notarized by 4 different people saying who has done what to an image. You can just let the cloud take care of that for you. So here's sort of a little graphics. Let's say this is our Amazon account. We have one server in it, and there's an EBS volume attached to that server. And we suspect that it's compromised or it's acting a little strange, and we want to dig into it deeper. So trigger the snapshot. Snapshot winds up in S3. And after some period of time, it will complete. But if we leave it there, and we're going to try and do our forensics all in the same place, then what can happen is someone else shows up with API keys. And what they can do with those API keys is burn the snapshot and then burn the rest of it out. Potentially. Depends on what permissions those keys have. But again, it's easier to grant admin permissions and sort them out later than it is to scope your permissions appropriately. So the benefit here, if you have a separate account, you can still do the same thing, create that snapshot, gets pushed into S3, but then it gets copied into the other account. Not just viewable, but actually copied into that other account. Now, yes, something bad can happen. Right? Someone can still show up and they can burn out the whole of the original account, but you still have that snapshot over in the other account. And their API keys, if they were to try and access that other account, are going to be just flat out rejected. So you may also be sad. Your attacker may also be sad. You've lost an account, but you have a way to trace back and see what actually happened. How did they get in, and what did they try and hide from you on the way in there? All right. So, some takeaways. What does your threat model look like? If you truly need high-quality forensics and you need to be able to say without the shadow of any doubt that, yes, an action that happened on this instance, I am able to read that data back. If you need that capability, don't use the SC1, ST1, or ephemeral storage. The quality of your forensics isn't going to be top of the class. If you don't need that capability, then just be aware of it. Understand the limitations involved when it comes to doing a forensic recovery. Know that if you have to do an analysis on an SC1 or ST1 drive, that it may require a massive volume on the other end to collect and see all those artifacts. The ephemeral storage is, well, it's ephemeral. You can't snapshot it. As soon as the EC2 instance gets terminated, it goes away. So you won't be able to see that data at all. Consider only allowing writes to non-root EBS volumes. That AMI, with all of its artifacts, can be very, very bad for your signal-to-noise ratio. It is possible that if you have a very long-running instance or you have a large history of AMIs or just a lot of data on it, that there'll be too much noise for you to be able to find the deleted files, especially if you're not lucky enough to start out with known hashes of your seed files. If you're looking for Apache logs, Nginx logs, whatever software you're using, and you're looking to see where those went, or then you may not be able to find them, or you may take you a very long time to find those log files if they were successfully recovered. Also, use multiple accounts. This is something that I say a lot, kind of big proponent of it. They are free to create, and using multiple accounts means that you can separate out and reduce your risk. You put up more blast walls, so that way if something bad does happen, you don't lose everything. Especially because a breach of a server, because I'm sure all of us can think of that one developer that just doesn't have time to figure out their policies and uses an administrative policy, or maybe there's something wrong in your policy that allows for privilege escalation, or someone put API keys on an instance, whatever it is, that if you have done that breach of that server could be a loss of all of your stuff. The cloud gives and the cloud takes away. It will give you as many servers as you want with an API key, as long as your credit card still will allow the transaction. But at the same time, it also allows you to take away all of those servers with an API key. That account lets you limit the blast radius. It keeps your forensics importantly out of that blast radius. Finally, also enable CloudTrail. It's great for looking and seeing what API calls have happened. It's great for seeing what API calls are being denied. But make sure that those CloudTrail logs are being written to another account, because if you're leaving it in the same account as your potentially compromised infrastructure, then you might have a big problem as well when it comes to that. Be careful what you write to an AMI. A really common pattern is for an organization to create an AMI for use internally. It's very easy to do. Then you have to customize for exactly what you need. But if that AMI is has API keys, static keys written to it as part of the building process, it's potentially out there and visible. If you write sensitive data to AMI, then either someone in your account may see it, or if that AMI is shared publicly, then others may potentially be able to see that data as well. Yeah, thank you very much. Got a few minutes for questions, but sort of quickly, we're hiring. If you're interested, you know someone who's interested, you like working for a very stylish clothing manufacturer that also makes lots of t-shirts and also on the side dabbles in cloud communications and connecting the world, come join us. We also have a bug bounty program. Please come hack us. Follow the rules on BugCrowd, but we would love to have more people taking a poke and seeing what's possible. Finally, if you want my contact information, go ahead and text Derbycon to this phone number, and you'll get my email address. So with that, thanks. Any questions? Yeah. So the question was, do you have different master accounts as well, or only sort of multiple sub-accounts underneath the one master? And for a little bit of context for people that may not know, Amazon allows you to link multiple AWS accounts to a single master payer account that is basically like your friend that says, oh yeah, I got the tab. That account can also create other accounts. In this case, the limit of an API key is the account it's in. If your master account has computation running in it and is potentially accessible by an attacker, then I would say you'd want different master accounts. If your master account is very locked down, then it would be fine to just use different sub-accounts, because the API key in sub-account A isn't going to work for sub-accounts B through Z. Anyone else? Yes.
When you were looking at the source files,
Mm-hmm.
the perfectly drive files, the 30 files, did you compared like the first 300 bytes or whatever?
Yeah.
To figure out if they're the same. Did you look into locality sensitive hashing at all to compare the two, maybe?
No, I did not. I was just looking sort of at the first chunk of the files. I did pull some of those files down locally just to make sure that I wasn't missing anything. Yeah, I was only looking at the sort of the beginning.
Okay. If you do that, you can calculate the memory difference between them.
Okay.
And even if the beginning was corrupted, you could still tell that they were mostly the same.
Okay. Yes. Interesting. Okay. I think part of the other reason why I did just sort of the first few hundred bytes was to see, because I would get multiple text files back that were originally one large file but had been split across into multiples, and so I was looking to see sort of how many of those early files I got. But yeah, doing sort of the locality hashing would be interesting to see sort of the extent of corruption in some of the files that maybe didn't get picked up by this. So, for your homework for next year. Any other questions? Yeah.
So how do the permissions work for that copy of the second account?
So the way that the snapshot copy permissions work is you can, from account A, say that you will share a snapshot to account B. In account B, then, you initiate a copy of that snapshot, the one that's been shared to you in account A, and that copy is going to reside in account B, because that's where your API keys are homed. So account B has the ability to copy, account A has the ability to share. When account B does that copy, you get a new version of that snapshot, but it's wholly contained in your separate account. Yes? So, question is, if you're baking in AMI, is it possible to, I guess, zero out some of those the changes? So this is another interesting quirk of EBS. If you read from dev 0 and write and fill the whole disk with zeros, and then you delete those large zero-filled files, this affects recovery minimally. It's sort of like there's optimization happening that's going, oh, you're writing a whole bunch of zeros? Yeah, totally. I need to look more into that, because I haven't tested that across some of the different file types and doing like sort of multiple generations of changes, which I think would be very interesting. It's probably better, if you wanted to do that, to get like truly random gibberish and write to the files. It's just reading from dev random on a source, like an instance source with very low entropy, can take. I stopped after a couple of days because it had barely filled up the drive, and I just didn't have time for that. So possible, maybe. Any other questions? All right, I think we're out of time, so thank you all very much.